Hi, and welcome to ThreatTraq Essentials, where we take a look at some everyday cybersecurity lessons that we can learn from this week's ThreatTraq stories. I'm here with Matt Kaiser, who's on the show this week. How you doing, Matt?
Doing all right. How you doing, Don?
Let's talk about some of the stories we covered. John Hogaboom brought us a story about some advanced persistent threat actors, really, right? Nation states.
That's right.
And about how difficult it can be to identify them. Tell me a little bit about that.
Right. So in this case, a group called Turla, that we know as most likely a Russian APT group, had compromised servers and software that was being run by the Iranian group. As it turns out, it makes it much harder to figure out who's actually behind these attacks. So some of these groups, what we'll do is, instead of like waiting for them to use a new IP address and mark that IP address as bad, what we'll do is say these techniques are being used, and therefore it's most likely this group or that group.
So they all have like a certain MO that they use.
Right, we call it their TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. And it's very easy for someone to buy a new server or switch malware, but it's a little bit harder for them to switch up the way that they behave intrinsically. So in this case, what we're seeing is these guys in the Turla group co-opting the servers owned by another group and using their software and their platforms to attack the targets that they want to attack, which makes it hard to tell who's actually doing the attacking.
So it gets misattributed to the group that would normally use those techniques.
Exactly, because of the way that we do attribution. So in this case, most people would have taken a look at this and said, well, I see it's this IP address, and it's this tool, and they're doing this thing. It is this Iranian group behind it. And they would have been wrong. And by any other case, we would have probably agreed with that assessment that the Iranian group was behind the attacks.
So for the average person, is there a takeaway here from this story?
I think the takeaway is always, when someone claims that they can attribute an attack to a particular attacker, take it with a grain of salt. This case sort of blows most of the theories of attribution out of the water. It seems to be a very rare occurrence that this would happen. I can't say for certain, because those sorts of things, those sort of secrets are very tightly kept. I'm actually kind of interested that NSA and GCHQ decided to publish this information, because whatever means that they use to get a hold of it is probably fairly technical and fairly valuable to them.
Let's talk about the story that Tony brought to us, and that was about smart home devices. Tell me about that.
So Tony had a story. There was a group called Security Research Labs who had done some research with Google Home and Amazon Alexa. They're both popular voice assistants. You might have a little device like that in your own home, and they've got applications that you can run on them that you say something to the device, it'll say something back to you. You get weather and sports and play games and all sorts of very interesting applications. But the point is, it's voice activated. And what they had managed to do is find a way to put some applications into the respective stores for Amazon Alexa and Google Home that it would seem that they had been turned off and they were no longer listening, when in fact they were actually recording the information that was being, if someone was speaking in the room, these apps would have recorded it.
So they truly were spying on you with these applications.
Yes. Now, the user had to voluntarily run that application, which makes it a little bit harder for an attacker to get it into place. And then what they had been doing was, every once in a while they would send, so the device would speak a sentence that wasn't actually audible. So it would keep the application running. Usually these things will time out after a certain amount of time if no one speaks, or no one speaks to it. And this thing would just sort of keep listening and keep listening and keep listening until it heard something, and then send whatever it had heard back.
So these researchers found a very clever way to get these devices to secretly listen in on conversations.
Exactly.
And then what could they do from there?
Depends on what information they got. And they had actually come up with two sort of main attack vectors. One is just listen to whatever was being said in the room, which is simpler, but not guaranteed to be effective. The second one is that they had an application that claimed that you needed to log back in with a password in order to activate something that had gone out of sync. Something had gone wrong with a device. We need you to do some update or some sort of installation, but we need your password to do it. Please tell us your password.
That's how they would steal your password.
Right.
Now, this was just research, correct? So it's not really out there in the wild that they're seeing yet.
That's right. So at this point, the 4 apps that were developed were put there by the researchers. They were taken down. Google and Amazon were both notified, and they're both looking into ways of preventing these same sorts of attacks, which is good, which is the right way to do this sort of research.
So given that this is just research, there's still probably some lessons maybe that people can take about these home devices and installing apps on them?
I think that if you use this sort of device, sort of be aware of what apps you're running. It's sort of the same model as if you're running an Android or an iPhone, an Apple device. Run apps that you know about and are generally trusted, have a larger user base. If you can determine these sorts of things before you run an app, it's generally a good idea. You don't want to run some sort of thing it's got like three likes and it's from some company you've never heard of. The same sort of general reputational decisions you might make when installing a phone app, same sort of thing you should do with application for one of these voice activated assistants.
And be sure that you periodically check what apps you have installed, because that's not readily apparent like it is on your phone. You really should go into the app for the device and check periodically perhaps what apps you actually have installed.
Yes, that's a good idea.
So you brought us a story about a backdoor into some gaming companies. Tell me about that.
Sure. So there's a group called WinT that's been around for a couple of years, been pretty well researched. They've been known to target gaming and software companies. And the new tool that ESET had discovered that WinT was using is a backdoor into the Microsoft SQL Server. And it's fairly technically advanced. I mean, there are other ways to achieve what they had achieved, except this one is much stealthier and leaves less of a trace on the system when it's installed. But what it would let you do is connect directly to the database that stores the state of the game, and then do things like, share money with other users or manipulate the currency in certain ways to make a profit.
So for gamers out there, people who use these type of services, how can they protect themselves?
I'm not sure there's very much that a user could do to protect themselves. Basically, this is a backdoor into the very heart of the game itself, and users may not even notice something is going wrong. If anything happens that's out of the ordinary, I would say report it to the abuse contacts for the game that you're playing. If suddenly your in-game bank account is completely empty, or items are missing, or things like that, I wouldn't necessarily say that's a sign that this particular attack is happening, but I think you would certainly be shocked to find that something of value is missing from your account, and you should definitely contact abuse contacts for the game.
All right, well, thank you, Matt.
Sure.
And thank you for watching. As always, if you want to learn anything more about these stories, click on the link below for a playlist and take a deeper dive. And we'll see you next time.